For those of you that are just coming in, we're going to get started right around 6 o'clock. We're going to give everybody a chance to join in. But while we're waiting, if you want to type a quick hello into the chat and let us know where you're from, we would love to get to know you a little bit before we get started. For those of you that have just come in, this is Giant Conversations, life in the parks, life here in Sequoia and Kings Canyon. So you are in the right place if that's what you were hoping to join tonight. So we're going to get started here in just a minute. We're going to wait just another minute or two to give some time for everybody to join tonight. If you get a chance, go ahead and type a quick hello into the chat and let us know where you're from. We've got Leo from Putnam County, New York. Welcome, Leo. Thanks for staying up late with us. And Jane Thomas in Tacoma, but formerly from Visalia. And there's Jack, who worked at Sequoia in 1990. Awesome. Well, welcome back virtually to the parks, Jack. And Janet from Fresno. Janet, thanks for joining. We've got a local. Valerie from Santa Clara. Awesome. Oh, it looks like we got people from Wisconsin. And Ginny from Seattle, who loves Sequoia and Kings. And we got some South Lake Tahoe. Awesome. Thank you all so much for introducing yourselves and letting us know that you're here. One of the things we love the most about Giant Conversations is just getting to know everybody and getting to really understand where our audience is from and their history with the park. And it's just a lot of fun for us to get to know you a little bit. So thank you all so much for letting us know where you're at in the chat. And I just want to formally welcome everybody to Giant Conversations. We're going to go ahead and get started. Again, this is Giant Conversations, where we're going to be talking about life here in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks and some of the endangered species that are here in our parks. And before we get started, I want to start off with just a couple of introductions. First, my name is Katie Whiteman. I'm the Field Institute Director for the Sequoia Parks Conservancy here in Sequoia and Kings Canyon. We are the official nonprofit partner to Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks, and we do a lot of different things to support our parks. And Giant Conversations is one of those things that we do to help support the park and help to provide access to the parks and to the resources in the parks. And tonight, I've got a team behind me helping out. We've got a lot of our directors that are behind the scenes making everything run smoothly. We've got Gary Rogers, our communications director, Christy Goldstone, our finance director, Tamara Marks, our philanthropy director, and Savannah Boiano, our executive director. So even though you don't see them, there's a huge team behind me helping to make sure this runs smoothly. And also, we are super lucky to have Danny Boiano and Tyler Coleman with us tonight. These two are our park scientists who really do help us understand life in the parks. Now, Danny, specifically from 2001 to 2022, managed the Aquatic Ecosystems Program for Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks, and he focused on restoring high elevation aquatic ecosystems and recovering endangered frog species. He is currently the branch chief for physical and wildlife scientists here in the parks, and in his career, he has worked as an ecologist, a fishery biologist, and biological technician for various national parks and forests and universities, and also some state agencies. He holds a master's degree and a bachelor's degree in natural resources and fisheries. So Danny brings a ton of experience, and I'm so excited to hear him talk about our aquatic species here in the parks tonight. And right next to him, we've got Tyler Coleman, who is our terrestrial wildlife program manager here in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks. He started working with wildlife in 1999 as a part of a grizzly bear DNA research project in Glacier National Park, which, I mean, that just sounds super cool right off the bat. And since then, he has held various wildlife management and research positions in federal agencies, state agencies, and also nonprofit organizations. In 2004, he officially began his National Park Service career in Yellowstone, working on their bear program there. And he completed his PhD at Montana State University in 2012 and has since worked in Oregon at Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument and now here in Sequoia and Kings Canyon. And as you can tell, both of these guys bring a huge amount of knowledge and a huge amount of resource to our conversation tonight. So we're going to hear from both of these guys throughout this evening, and we're so excited to hear what they have to share. So Danny and Tyler, thank you both so much for joining us tonight. Now, before we begin tonight, we have a special message from our Executive Director, Savannah Boiano. We wanted to share her inspiring words with you as an introduction to this very giant conversation tonight.
Hello and welcome to Giant Conversations. My name is Savannah Boiano, Executive Director of Sequoia Parks Conservancy. Over the last couple of months, Sequoia Parks Conservancy has really been thinking about the role of conversation in affecting positive change for our national parks. And over the coming months, this webinar series will include you in the conversations about some of the most pressing issues facing Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks. Established in 1890, Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks are two of the nation's oldest national parks. With 131 years experience managing this landscape, some people think that park staff know it all, can solve it all, and should save everything. And while they are superheroes who go to extraordinary lengths to protect and preserve, they can't do it alone. They rely on all of us to help them. And one of the ways that we can begin our effective stewardship is to learn about the unique issues facing these two parks. Sequoia Parks Conservancy invites you behind the scenes to hear about the issues and to join in the dialogue about the actions and practices to create healthy and more resilient national parks. I think that national parks are where the great American conversation takes place. And over the course of my career, I've talked to thousands of people helping to draw a straight line between their life and what happens in a national park. Sequoia Parks Conservancy wanted to extend the invitation to join the conversation to you. And so thank you so much.
All right, well, that was a great message from Savannah. Savannah, thank you so much. And we're just about ready to launch into our topic for the evening. But before we do, we need to go over just a couple of things before we get started. Throughout the evening, we are going to extend the invitation, like Savannah said, to you to participate in the dialogue and to participate in conversation. We'll be asking you different polling questions. We're going to have 3 different designated times for Q&A, so you can interact with Danny and Tyler on 3 different occasions. And we do ask that when you ask a question that you do use that Q&A box down at the bottom of your screens, so that way we can submit those questions. Please don't put them in the chat because we don't always see them because the chat can get really busy. So please use that Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. And also we do ask, in order to preserve everyone's experience tonight, and we keep this a positive experience where we're learning and we're having that great American dialogue, we do ask that you please bring your respectful comments, please bring your respectful ideas, and please bring your respectful questions. If we do feel like someone's being disrespectful, we will unfortunately remove you from the webinar. So again, let's make sure that this is a fun and respectful event. And with that, we're going to go ahead and launch right into our conversation tonight. And we are going to talk about specifically not just life in the parks, but endangered life in the parks. And before we bring in Danny Boiano to talk to us about what endangered species are, we have a question for you. So we have our first polling question tonight. And so this is a chance for you to all interact and join the conversation. And our first question, it's going to pop up on the screen. So you can click true or false whenever you see that polling question. And the polling question is going to be, when we say the term endangered species, so this is true or false. So true or false, when we say the term endangered species, we are only referring to animals or mammals. So what do you think, true or false? Let us know. Go ahead and submit your answers. We're going to give everybody about a minute so we can start in our conversation, but go ahead and think about this question. When we say the term endangered species, we're only referring to mammals or animals. You can go ahead and hit true or false right there on that poll pop-up screen. All right, so let's see what we've got. Let's go ahead and publish those results. All right. True or false? All right, for the 98% of you that said false, you are correct. It is false. And don't worry, if you hit true, no worries. We're here to learn. So false, a species, when we're talking about an endangered species, we can be talking about a mammal. We can be talking about a tree, a coral, a fungus, an insect, or any other number of life forms on this planet. So it's a really wide topic. And Danny, can you help us understand a little bit more about what endangered species are? So when we say the term endangered species, what does that mean exactly?
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Happy to be here. And thanks, Katie. So endangered species comes from actually a law in the United States. The Endangered Species Act, which I'm sure many of you have heard before, was passed into law by the US Congress in 1973. And its purpose is to protect and recover imperiled species and the ecosystems upon which they depend. So that comes right from the Act. And there's a couple of government agencies that administer the Act. The US Fish and Wildlife Service has responsibility for terrestrial and freshwater species, and the National Marine Fisheries Service is responsible for marine species. And so under the Act, species are listed as either endangered or threatened. Or you could turn that around and say threatened or endangered, and we often shorten that to T and E. So if you hear T and E species, that's what it's referring to. So endangered, which is the more severe status, species listed as endangered are in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. And species conversely listed as threatened, it's a little less severe, they're likely to become endangered within the foreseeable future. So those are the two types of listing statuses under the Act or the law. So when we say endangered species, that's kind of in a nutshell what we mean. And so to give you a few statistics, the species listed under the US Fish and Wildlife Service, so those are the terrestrial and freshwater species, there's a lot of them, 939 plants and 723 animals. So over 1,600 different species or subspecies or forms of animals and plants. So that, I actually didn't know the actual number because I work in my kind of area of Sequoia and Kings Canyon. And that number is constantly changing as time goes on. I did not realize the number was that big. So that was a good learning thing for me today. And then the other species that are under the National Marine Fisheries Service, so the marine species, there's 164 of those. And some of those are also the same ones on the other list, the US Fish and Wildlife Service list, and includes some foreign species as well, species that don't just occur in the United States. So together, that's over 1,800 species of animals and plants that are covered by the Endangered Species Act. So just think about that across the country. It's a huge thing. So along with species that get listed as either endangered or threatened, before they get listed, they're proposed to be listed. And those species are called candidate species. So when research and data and observations suggest that a species is imperiled, the agencies and all the people that work with those species gather the data and they analyze it and they determine whether the species is in dire enough straits that it should be listed as threatened or endangered. And if it's not listed, it either stays a candidate species or they drop off the list. But along with the listing status, there's what's called critical habitat. And that is intuitive. It's habitat that is needed to support recovery of those listed species. And so when a species is proposed for listing, the service must consider whether there are areas of habitat that are believed to be essential to their conservation. And if so, those areas may be proposed for designation as critical habitat. And so that's kind of the two big pieces, 2 of 3 pieces of the Endangered Species Act: listing status, critical habitat, And then there's recovery plans. And not every species that's listed has a recovery plan, but a lot of them do. And those recovery plans are very detailed documents that go through the state of science and knowledge on a species and the ways that give us the best chance at recovering those species to the point that they could eventually be delisted and taken off the endangered species list and be in a lot better state than they are now. So one more quick element of this is, why does this matter? So why should we save endangered species? Well, in the Endangered Species Act, Congress recognized that endangered and threatened species of wildlife and plants are of aesthetic, ecological, educational, historical, recreational, and scientific value to the nation and its people. That's language right from the Act. And some of the many specific reasons that we should invest money and effort into actions to conserve these species include: they give benefits of natural diversity, contributions to medicine, biodiversity and agriculture, environmental monitors, or you may have heard the term canary in the coal mine, or indicator species. They provide ecosystem services, other economic values, and intangible values. Those are all some of the reasons why we should care about trying to save endangered species. So that's the background, and I'm just going to quickly go into from the national to the local at Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks here in Southern Sierra Nevada in California. We have several listed species. And in the mammal animal group, we have Sierra Nevada Bighorn Sheep, which are endangered, Sierra Nevada Red Fox, which are endangered, Fisher, which is endangered, and Tyler is going to talk about all of them soon. And we also have, believe it or not, grizzly bear or brown bear, which is a threatened species, used to occur in Sequoia National Park and other parts of California until it went extinct in the state way back in the 1920s. And then for amphibians, we have two species of frogs, the mountain yellow-legged frog and the Sierra Nevada yellow-legged frog. They're both endangered. We have a threatened toad, the Yosemite toad, and we have a candidate species, the foothill yellow-legged frog, which unfortunately used to occur in the park and was last seen here in 1970. And so it's been extirpated from the park. And then we have one fish that's listed, the little current golden trout is threatened. And we have one reptile that's a candidate species, the western pond turtle. So the western pond turtle and the foothill yellow-legged frog, they're currently proposed for listing, and they're in a one-year process of looking at the data and trying to determine whether they should be listed or not. And then we have one bird, the California condor, that is endangered, and it's basically doesn't occur in Siki anymore, but they have been expanding in California, as many of you might know, and they've been starting to fly over the park, but they haven't established a reproductive population or a roosting colony. And so we consider them still essentially extirpated from the park, but hopefully they're going to return and be established here very soon. So those are all of our threatened and endangered species. You might have noticed there's no plants on the list. We only have T&E animals in the parks. And so that's my background for you on endangered species.
Danny, thank you so much for walking us through that. I think a lot of times when we think about endangered species, we think primarily just kind of like, oh, they're endangered. There's this one small element, but like you so eloquently told us about, there's this, there's a listing status, there's critical habitat, there's recovery plans. There's a lot of thought that goes into, what it is to be designated an endangered species, but it's not just about identifying the species, but the habitat. How do we recover those things? So thank you so much for bringing us to kind of this kind of common understanding when we say the term endangered species. What is the kind of broad view of that? And I think it's unique here in Sequoia and Kings Canyon that we have, almost a dozen listed species. And we think sometimes, like what Tyler's going to tell us a little bit about, of these are terrestrial species, but we have some of these lesser known aquatic species that people may not necessarily realize when they think about endangered species here in Sequoia and Kings. So thank you so much. And I want to make sure that we've got a couple of questions in our chat for Danny. And so we're going to do a couple of questions before we move on. Thank you all so much for putting questions in the box. It's super helpful. And one of our first questions when we're talking about endangered species comes from Virginia, and she asks if you can explain the term vulnerable.
Yeah, that's a great question. So vulnerable means that a species has some characteristics about either the way it lives or the habitat it lives in, the way it behaves, that basically makes it easier to be impacted by an external force. And so it makes it predisposed or easier to be impacted by exotic or non-native species, by pollution, by lots of different things that you can think of, by habitat alteration or habitat loss or damage. There's a lot of different things in the world that can have impacts on natural resources like wildlife. And so when a species is all of these species that are either listed or considered for listing, they're all vulnerable to certain threats. And it's a different set of threats for each species, but that's what, basically T&E species are inherently vulnerable to things that impact them heavily and make them decline.
Awesome. And another question from Noam, and they ask, if a species goes extinct, will it affect the area, the surrounding area?
That's another great question, and the answer is yes. There are different degrees of that. You may have heard the term keystone species, and a keystone species is like a central part of an ecosystem that touches many parts of it. And if that species was taken out of the ecosystem, there would be at minimum a big change or alteration to the ecosystem, and at maximum a short-term collapse and a realignment and a recalibration of the ecosystem over the long term. So think of coastal fish like steelhead and salmon on the west coast of North America. They go out to the ocean and they get huge, and they come back to these rivers where they spawn and reproduce, and they drop all of these nutrients back into the local system that otherwise wouldn't be there if they didn't go to the ocean and get big and came back. And so they're so important that they're food for all these other species, and even for humans economically, and cultures even revolved around them, like certain Native American tribes and other types of cultures. And so you take that species out of that ecosystem and it will very heavily change it.
Thank you, Danny. And we have time for about 2 more questions. And James asks, what is the rate of extinction from the list of endangered species? Do you happen to know the answer to that?
That is a great question. And I don't know the answer to that. Maybe Tyler does.
Tyler?
We can look it up, but I don't know that off the top of my head.
No,
I'd hazard a guess.
Very difficult. That's a good question. And it would probably be a little hard to find even, but animals they do go extinct on the list. So it's not 0, that's for sure.
All right. And Bernie Rossler, Bernie, welcome. Bernie's a longtime volunteer for our Dark Sky Festival. So Bernie, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining us for Giant Conversations. Bernie asks, is the presence of bullfrogs in the park part of the cause of the other amphibians becoming endangered?
That's another great question. And the answer is probably yes. For one species, the Western pond turtle, which is one of our candidate species that I mentioned in that list. It's not listed yet. It's currently proposed for listing. The Fish and Wildlife Service is requesting data so that the state of knowledge and the state of science of understanding the species, its range, its threats, its populations, how big they are, where they are, they can put all that together and determine whether the decline is big enough and the threats are big enough that they are warranted listing under the Act. And so we'll know that answer to that question in about a year. Because the process has just recently started, and bullfrogs are one of the threats for Western pond turtles, including in our park where we have a couple populations, and there's bullfrogs in those areas, and they have definitely had an impact on those populations.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you all so much for submitting questions into the question and answer box. Ian and James, I still see your questions. I'm going to hold on to those questions, and hopefully we'll have a chance to get back to those questions a little bit later, we have 2 more times of Q&A. So we'll make sure to get to your guys' questions here soon. But thank you all so much for submitting questions into the Q&A box. Now that we have a kind of a common understanding about what an endangered species is and some of the different facets that we need to be aware of when we're talking about endangered species, we're going to go ahead and transition to into talking about endangered species here in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks, and specifically some terrestrial species that Tyler Coleman is going to talk to us about, and 2 very specific, and he might even hint at a 3rd species, is 3 different animals listed here in the park as endangered, which is the Sierra Nevada red fox and the Sierra Nevada bighorn sheep. And before Tyler comes in and tells us a little bit more about these 2 really incredible species, we've got another question for you that we would like for you guys to answer in our poll. And the question is that we're curious, has anyone ever seen a Sierra Nevada red fox or Sierra Nevada bighorn sheep? I did see that someone was here from Bishop, so I'm curious to see if, being from the east side, if you've ever seen a bighorn sheep. So if everyone wants to take a minute and answer this question, again, have you ever seen a Sierra Nevada red fox or Sierra Nevada bighorn sheep? Give everybody a minute to share their answers. All right, I'm curious. Let's see if everybody's got a chance to respond. I want to see if anybody's seen any of these species. This will be good for Danny and Tyler too, to see if we have any documentation of seeing some of these 2 species. So Gara, if we can go ahead and publish those results. All right, yeah, it looks like we have about 19 people that have seen one of these 2 species. That's awesome. That's pretty incredible. And if you want to tell us a little bit about it in the chat, please feel free to share if you've seen any of those species here in the Sierra Nevada. We would love to hear about it in the chat. I remember the first time I saw a Sierra Nevada bighorn sheep on the east side, and I was shocked. They were so beautiful, incredible. I was shocked when I saw them. They were much bigger than I thought that they were going to be. And it was truly an incredible experience. So for those of you that have seen them, I'm sure that you had a similar experience. And so Tyler, I want to transition to you, and wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the Sierra Nevada bighorn sheep and the Sierra Nevada red fox, both of which are examples of the endangered mammals here in the Sierra Nevada. And Danny had mentioned also the fisher. So if you want to talk about the fisher too, feel free. And so specifically these species and what efforts the Park Service is doing to protect and restore some of these populations.
Absolutely. Thank you for everyone for participating. And yeah, I'm happy to talk about Sierra Nevada bighorn sheep. They are an important species in the park. The species is actually a subspecies of bighorn. There's a desert bighorn and Rocky Mountain bighorn, to name a couple of others that are not endangered. These ones that live here are particularly well adapted to high alpine environments. So they're very stout relative to, say, desert bighorn. And although they look quite big, they're actually quite short at the shoulder, about 2.5 to 3.5 feet tall, but very wide. Really, really well adapted for extreme environments. They have been endangered since about 1999, and at that point, there was only 125 individuals left in the entire Sierra, and that's roughly from like the Mona Lake area all the way down to south of Sequoia National Park. And the species began to decline because primarily of disease interacting with domestic livestock, sheep and goats. They get primarily pneumonia, but a couple of other diseases that led to a decreased population size, increased predation pressure, which further led to a smaller population. And you'll probably hear a theme between Danny and myself is that one of the biggest challenges with any endangered species, in particular mammals, once you get to a really small population size, that unleashes a host of other issues like inbreeding, things that are called demographic and environmental stochasticity, which is a fancy word for saying like bad things happen, right? Like landslides, extreme droughts, mega fires, things like that. Or it could just be bad luck. If you only have 4 animals left and you in one birth season, you only give birth to 2 males, well, that doesn't help you out very much. But basically, the sheep population was listed in 1999 and has been increasing ever since. The park is pivotal because the conservation plan structures the population into about 16 different herd units. There's tiny little subpopulations that are managed independently to help count and recover the sheep. Half of those herd units are in the park, and a couple of those herd units are used as source stock for translocations across the park, where ewes or females, adult females, are put in other places to help supplement the population. And since that's been happening, the moving around of females, the population has now increased to about 550 individuals, about half of which are adult females. We count mostly adult females with mammal populations in particular because the males are kind of window dressing. The females are the ones that are important because they have the babies that can kind of drive the recovery. So with endangered species, most of the act for mammals in particular, most of the recovery actions are focused on what do adult females need the most. So the park is assists with the recovery of the species. The bulk of the recovery actions are headed by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife out of the Bishop office. They are kind of the lead agency on all the recovery actions. We assist a little bit with what they do, but they really have a lot of boots on the ground. A lot of the effort that they do goes into translocations of animals, trying to supplementing populations. Here's a great example of a capture event where individuals are taken from one part of the population, given a radio collars and a bunch of other uncomfortable shots and everything, and then flown to other parts of the population and released to supplement areas where the animals are in decline or in really low numbers. So we just kind of help that happen, look through logistics, some compliance efforts, and also just through a little bit of funding and help putting boots on the ground. In addition, there's just people throughout the summer that are helping survey once those animals are on the ground to see where they're going, what they eat, where they live, and when they live and die. So that wraps up Bighorn Sheep. I can move on to red fox, which is our newest endangered species that was listed this August, I think it was. And the Sierra Nevada red fox is similar and then also occupies very high alpine areas in the Sierra Nevada. The population is one of the rarest mammals, one of the rarest animals on the planet at this point. These animals are very well adapted to high alpine, high elevation environments. They're very small, light bodied. You know, the males are no more than 10 or 11 pounds. The females a couple, 3 pounds lighter. They have big, relatively big furry paws that help them keep on top of the snow, like this fox here. Now we have been, this animal was thought to be extirpated from the Sierra, which is different from an extinction. Extirpation means it no longer lives in a particular area. And we, as biologists, thought they were gone until about 2010. And an individual was caught on a camera, a trail camera in Sonora Pass, which is just north of Yosemite National Park. Since then, all the agencies have got together, started a recovery team, developed a recovery plan at this point, and we're all pitching in to survey for these animals. Since then, we've identified a number of individuals. In fact, in the last 12 years, 47 more individuals have been caught on camera. Some of those are the same individuals. So a minimum population size for the Sierra is probably 15 to 20, really, really low numbers. We have not had a sighting in the park since 1993. That was at Little Five Lakes, except for one of the photos that were just shown there. That was actually just outside the park about 1.5 years ago. We have started a camera survey effort, again, led by Cal Fish and Wildlife out of Bishop. We have some fantastic biologists there who got this image for us. And this is, I think, near Lamarck Pass, just outside of the park. So not officially in the park, but I'm sure at some point it's been in the park. But our long-term plans are to continue to do camera trap surveys, expand to more places as possible, because we think we have very good habitat in the park, although we haven't identified more individuals yet. I think we will. And down the road, in about 2 years, I think we plan to use scat detection dogs to find red fox scats, collect the samples, and then process those in the lab to get a positive DNA detection of a red fox. And how am I doing time-wise?
Doing great.
Okay. I'm happy to jump into Fisher if we have a couple minutes, or
Yeah, we've got a couple minutes. Go ahead and
oh, we
go
did.
ahead and
Okay,
jump
good.
into Fisher. Yeah.
I'm glad someone's paying attention to the time. Another very important park species, endangered species, is the Fisher. It's a forest weasel, basically, that lives throughout the west slope of the parks, pretty much from tree line down. But it's does very well in mixed conifer forests and old growth forests, places with mature large trees that they use for denning. Unfortunately, a lot of the habitat that in the fire this year, but the park has been very active in research the last year and a half, along with a team of other people. I think some of them might be on this call. Hopefully they are. They said they might. We've been radio coloring individuals with GPS colors to help learn how they're responding to this recent fire and previous fires, and how they might navigate the landscape around those fires. And in addition, we hope that we learn even really basic things about them in the parks, like where do they den, where do they raise their kits, where do they spend the first few months of their life after they've been born.
Awesome. Tyler, thank you so much for letting us know about some of those terrestrial species in the park. And I had no idea that the Sierra Nevada red fox was limited to just almost 15 to 20 individual, like, did you say 15 to 20 species in the Sierra Nevada?
Yeah, that's a minimum size. So that excludes, there's a couple of pockets of population that actually goes all the way up to Mount Hood, Oregon, roughly. And that excludes that population. There's another really tiny population in Lhasa National Park that's incredibly inbred, but hanging on. So all those animals, that's basically from like Sonora Pass all the way south to the end of our park. We're looking at a small number of species, like our estimates, the minimum size of maybe 15 to 20.
Wow, yeah, that is, and I think that really demonstrates, just, again, coming back to what we talked about earlier, or when we talk about endangered species, and that how critical it really is for habitat. You touched on habitat, and really once that is identified, these species are identified, those recovery plans become such a huge piece in helping to restore some of these populations. And it was really neat to see kind of with the bighorn sheep what that looks like. And I think that the work done interagencyly, I don't know if I said that word, the work that's done between the agencies really is, would you say that's a really pivotal piece of restoring populations?
Crucial. Yeah, parks are very important because we're often the core areas. We have a lot of relatively undisturbed habitat relative to other places. However, none of these species that we talk about are recovered by one agency. And it's not just one federal agency. It's state agencies like Cal Fish and Wildlife, who are amazing partners, but it's also universities, nonprofits, citizen groups, and sometimes even international groups, depending on the species. So yeah, it takes a lot of effort to get these animals on the right track.
I believe it. Yeah. And I love that idea about when we talk about, when we talk about endangered species, we're not just talking about the National Park Service. We're talking about so many different types of groups and people that come together to really that are a part of that recovery plan in very unique ways. So Tyler, thank you so much for explaining a little bit of that to us. And we're going to go ahead and open up some questions to you that are here in our chat. And again, if anybody has any questions for Tyler or Danny, go ahead and put them in the Q&A box. And we've gotten a couple of questions about the fire. And people are curious on whether or not the KMP complex had an effect on some of these species, because it's so new. And do we have any of that information yet?
I can say for bighorn sheep and Sierra Nevada red fox, most likely not. These animals live at very, very high elevations. For the Fisher, we're just trying to figure that out. Generally speaking, an animal that is both a predator and a prey animal, like fisher, requires cover, canopy cover, in particular, one of the things that they need to complete their life cycle. So when areas are really scorched and there's no cover, they tend to die more often. They have fewer places to cover. They might have lost some of their prey items, and they might have less large areas to complete like a reproductive life cycle or complete everything they need throughout the year to kind of live.
Thank you. And then we have a question from Hunter Tidd, who is actually, Hunter, it's great to see your question. He was one of our seasonal staff at Crystal Cave this last year, and he wants to know what's the elevation range for the red fox, and is it similar to the pika?
Yeah, I don't, I mean, in the park, we can't say exactly, but in the Sierra in general, it's like 8,000 to 9,000 feet, all the way up to 13,000 to 14,000 feet. They tend to occupy lower elevation areas as you move north, but there's still so much we don't understand about the species because we have so few data points.
And Lou asks, Lou, it's great to see you on here. He says, do we have an estimated number for fishers? He says that he saw one on the cliffs of the Watchtower around 2006, which is a super cool sighting, Lou. And so do we have a number of estimated fishers in the park?
Well, in the park, no. In the southern Sierra Nevada, which is kind of there's the population segment, which is roughly Yosemite all the way down to kind of the toe of the Sierra. I mean, less than 200, but it's a moving target because the habitat every year has changed substantially with some of these large, massive fires and extensive drought.
I think we've got time for one more question. This is an interesting question from a participant, Gnome. Do you think the fox, the foxes hunt in the parks? Like, do they live in the park because they might have more access to their food source, or?
Yeah, if they're in the park, they'll hunt in the park, and anywhere they live. I mean, they're an animal that has a high, what you call energetic load. So they're gonna have to eat a lot, and they live in really cold places. So anywhere they are, they're gonna hunt. They have a humongous home range and can travel really, really long distances. So any animal that's been outside or inside the park has probably lived in other kind of municipalities, so to speak.
You know what? One more question specific to the bighorns. It comes from Bill, and he asks if there are some east side trails that are closed to help protect the bighorns.
Not that I'm aware of in the park. Outside of the park, it's possible, but I guess I don't know that for sure. I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries. These are really interesting questions. Again, thank you everybody for submitting questions. We don't have time to get into all of these, but again, we'll have another question and answer at the end of our talk tonight. So we'll be able to get to some of these questions here soon. And so we're going to go ahead and transition back to Danny here in just a minute of talking about our kind of last topic of the evening about some lesser known endangered species in our parks. And we kind of touching back earlier, when we talk about endangered species, I find that a lot of people think about some of those terrestrial species, the species that Tyler mentioned, the bighorns, the foxes, the fishers, but not a lot of people realize that they don't always think about some of those smaller creatures that are also endangered and critical to our ecosystems, like frogs, for example, and other amphibians and aquatic animals. And during our last topic of the evening, we'll be talking about specifically some aquatic species, and particularly the mountain yellow-legged frog, and the successful efforts that have taken place to restore this species to the Sierra Nevada. And before we transfer to Danny to tell us about this pretty remarkable story, we have another question for you all that have joined in tonight. And the question is another true or false question. See what you guys think. Is true or false? The mountain yellow-legged frog was once the most abundant amphibian in the Sierra Nevada. So what do you think? True or false? give everybody a minute to ask. All right, so again, true or false, the mountain yellow-legged frog was once the most abundant amphibian in the Sierra Nevada. All right, Gary, let's go ahead and publish those results to see what people think. Ooh, divided a little bit. We've got 81% of people that say true and 19%, so 11 people that say false. And the answer is true. So it's kind of a fun fact. Once the most numerous amphibians in the Sierra Nevada, or the yellow mountain-legged frog was once the most numerous amphibian in the Sierra Nevada, but today they have disappeared from almost 92% of their historic range. So this was once, again, one of the most abundant amphibians, and now, again, completely disappeared from 92% of their range. And so, Danny, you've been directly involved with the restoration of the mountain yellow-legged frog for 20 years. Can you tell us about the process and the progress you've personally seen to restore these frogs to that 90%, the 92% of their historic range here in the Sierra Nevada?
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about it. Thank you. So it's a long story. It's a layered story, and it goes back to the 1980s when people started observing declines in these really abundant species that were in lots of places in the high and middle elevations of the Sierra Nevada. And then that kicked off a lot of research, and the research showed consistently that, yep, the declines were real, and it started figuring out some of the reasons for the decline. And then that went into management. And that's where agencies like the Park Service and the program that I've been working with, but lots of other entities in the Sierra Nevada as well, have tried to address the situation with management actions and continued research in collaboration with researchers. So it's a long multi-decade story, and it's still unfolding and still evolving. And so what has happened in the second half of that story essentially is when I came to the picture, and that was in 2001 when I got this position with the Park Service here in Sequoia Kings, and we were starting basically a management program involved with a lot of restoration actions targeted on these mountain yellow-legged frogs that had declined. They had not been listed at that time. They actually they don't just occur in the Sierra Nevada. There is a disjunct population in Southern California of the frogs in Southern California and in the Sierra Nevada are actually there's actually two different species, and they're part of a complex. They're very related. They look a lot alike, but basically in Southern California and the Southern Sierra Nevada into the middle of Kings Canyon National Park is the southern species, the mountain yellow-legged frog. And then in northern Kings Canyon and all the way to north of Lake Tahoe is the northern species, the Sierra Nevada yellow-legged frog. They look alike, they act alike, they both kind of interact with the ecosystem similarly, but they're technically two different species. And so the southern species is very small, it's almost extinct, it's been critically endangered since 2002, it got listed. But the Sierra Nevada populations were doing much better until recently. And it got bad enough that they were listed in 2014. Both species were listed as endangered by the Fish and Wildlife Service. So we were actually doing work, going back several decades ago before they were even officially listed, because it was clear that there was a big problem. And so what happened was I was part of a big interagency group that has had different players over time based on where people worked and people that retired or not. But a group of anywhere from 20 to 50 people have been actively working on trying to recover these species. And we call that basically the frog recovery team. And how it works is it's somewhat facilitated by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, since they administer the Endangered Species Act. But we're all kind of equal players that are invested in the same goal, and that's recovering these species and eventually hopefully delisting them through all of our different actions in the different part of the Sierra Nevada, the different part of their range, and collectively, hopefully we can make a big difference. And so it took a long time for us to figure out the the full data set, the state of science of the species, the threats, what populations were there, what was feasible for recovery actions. And in the early 2010s, we came out with what's called a conservation assessment. It's a formal technical document that basically analyzed and summarized the status of the species. And then we went from that and we developed what's called a conservation strategy. And I mentioned in my intro that there's what's called a recovery plan, that a lot of species have a formal recovery plan. Well, the mountain yellow-legged frog complex are two species that do not have a formal recovery plan, but we have what's called a conservation strategy, which is like the next best thing, which is really thinking heavily about the situation. What are the best ways to recover them? And then we publish that document, and it's kind of like a recovery plan light, if you will. So that is kind of what is driving a lot of the interagency frog recovery team actions across the Sierra Nevada. And we are basically doing things like habitat restoration and population monitoring and disease monitoring, because disease is one of the big threats to the species, the amphibian chytrid fungus. We are doing detailed population surveys, genetic studies. We're trying to do treatments in which we will actually treat frog populations to reduce their disease loads, really similar to what's happening with humans now in COVID, where we've been getting our vaccinations and trying to help us in that regard. Really similar things happen in wildlife populations. And then working with populations that are struggling, if a population is looking like it might go to zero and we will lose a population in a particular site, we will do what's called emergency salvage, where we might collect tadpoles from a population and give them to a cooperating zoo. We've been working a lot with the Oakland Zoo and the San Francisco Zoo, and they will stabilize those tadpoles, clear them of the disease, raise them to frog size or adult frog size, sometimes immunize them, which means they actually expose them to that amphibian chytrid fungus disease, clear them of the disease, hope that they have a beneficial immune response from that, and then we put them back in the wild, which is called a reintroduction. We bring them back to the wild and put them out in their natural habitat, and then we monitor the results, and hopefully that allows us to keep that population going, and eventually hopefully that population can grow, and then we could use those animals to repopulate other areas where populations have been lost. And that action is called a translocation, when you move frogs or tadpoles from one site directly to another without the zoo step. And so there's a lot of actions in there. It's all spelled out in the conservation strategy. Our work that we've been doing in Sequoia Kings is completely aligned with the conservation strategy. We have annual meetings where we talk about our progress, our learning, and we try to basically have adaptive management where we're trying to be as effective as possible over time. So it's this huge project. It involves the National Park Service, the U.S. Forest Service, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, non-governmental organizations like the zoos, academia and university, lots of different universities in California and elsewhere, and then other nonprofits like Sequoia Parks Conservancy and Yosemite Conservancy that are helping us find funding and volunteers to help do this work, because it's very expensive and it takes a long time to make a difference in the problem over time. So that's kind of a big view of kind of the process, how it works in general, how we have interacted in the larger group, and kind of how we do our thing here locally. And then just to go into one of the actions, that what we call captive rearing, where we will collect tadpoles. It's pretty amazing. We'll go to a site, we'll collect tadpoles, we will use a helicopter to fly them out, because we wouldn't, if we collect 100 or 200 tadpoles, we'd have to keep them in water, and we'd have to hike them about 20 miles out from the backcountry to a trailhead, and it's just not feasible. They would most likely die during that hike. So it's time sensitive. So we fly them out in helicopters. The zoo meets us at the helibase. They take the tadpoles, they put them in a cooler with the right water temperature, and they drive them to the Bay Area. They stabilize them, they grow them for a year or two to frogs. They drive them back. We fly them out to the backcountry and we release them. That's a pretty amazing involved process. And we have had remarkable success as far as 90% or more of the tadpoles that we've collected have successfully gone through that whole journey and were put back into the lakes. And it's a process that we just started in the last few years. So we don't really have the long-term results yet. We have to wait like another 5 or 10 years to see what happens at each of those sites. And what we hope happens is that there's going to be more survival there than would have happened if we did not take that step. Those survivors are going to grow into frogs that are resistant to the disease that's still out there, that amphibian chytrid fungus. Similar to how, you know, humans can live with cancer for a long time, the frogs can live with this disease for a long time if they can control it. And then they can breed and reproduce, and they can keep that population going. And if it gets big enough, we can use those animals as seed animals for additional restoration in other locations. So that's how we hope the process is gonna work or unfold. We still need several years to see that process out. But what's good is there's lots of locations out there that we can do this work at. We still have time, and we still have material in the form of different populations to play with. Play is the wrong word, to work with. And we're basically using all of our effort, all of our expertise, all of our motivation, all of the funding that we can find to do this at a large enough scale to make a difference. And so that's some of the work that I've been doing. And Katie, do we have time to show a quick video?
We absolutely do. Go ahead, Danny.
Okay, should I show it at this point?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Is my screen shared, or do I need to do that?
If you go ahead and share your screen with us, we'll all be able to see your video.
Okay, there we go. And can you see that?
No, we're still not seeing it, but if you hit the green
share button,
there we go. Yeah, there it is.
Okay, I'm gonna maximize it, and we have a 2-minute video for you. Enjoy.
In one of our restoration areas, we had an incredible increase in the frog population. Within 3 to 4 years of starting to remove the fish, the frog population increased by about 5,000 frogs and 15,000 tadpoles. In 2001, when we started the restoration, we had about 570 lakes and ponds with trout. We've successfully removed trout from 10 lakes, and we're almost done with 10 more lakes. So by 2015, we will have restored about 20 of our 570 fish lakes and ponds. Therefore, there will be many areas for people to continue enjoying the parks by doing recreational angling. But at the same time, we will have restored as much habitat as possible to benefit native species.
Amphibian populations worldwide are threatened, and in the past few decades, many have gone extinct, and there are many more that are on the brink. So a project like this, where we can help sustain a population of a threatened amphibian, is really rewarding. I'm hoping that our efforts up here in the High Sierra will help keep these mountain yellow-legged frogs healthy and surviving for as long as possible.
I think when visitors experience these restored areas, when they're able to walk along the trail and see frog after frog hop into the river, it brings out something innate and something joyful and childlike in each visitor, and they can't help but share it. And that's a really gratifying aspect of this whole experience.
Okay. So, were you guys able to see all that?
Yeah, we did. Thank you so much for sharing that, Danny.
And do I have to stop share?
Nope, you're good.
Okay, great. So hopefully that was helpful for people to kind of see some of the habitat and see some of the action of what we're trying to explain. Thought it'd be a good little 2-minute thing for people to experience. And so I mentioned how in that recovery actions, we do habitat restoration, and that is the habitat restoration that we do. All of our high lakes were historically fishless, and about 50% of our lake surface area in the high lakes have been stocked with non-native fish, and they're one of the big threats to the species. That's happening all across the Sierra Nevada, all across their range. And so part of our recovery action is restoring a small percentage of our high lake habitat that has non-native fish in it. And so that's what that the piece of that video was referring to.
Danny, thank you so much for sharing that story with us and also sharing the video. I think it's really interesting to be able to see some of this habitat and how remote it is when we talk about the alpine and how high some of these lakes are. It's one thing to say it, but another thing to see it. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. And we're going to go ahead and open up for our final Q&A. We've got about 20 questions in our Q&A box right now. So we have plenty of time to get to everybody's questions. And we'll start first with talking a little bit about the mountain yellow-legged frog, and we'll transition to some of the other questions in there too. We've got a great question from one of our young members that is for both you and Tyler. So we'll ask that question here in just a couple minutes. And so we're going to start. We had a question, something you had mentioned, Danny, was diseases that naturally affect the frogs. And we had a couple of questions here that that asked about that. And sorry, you guys, I'm kind of just scrolling through some of these questions to be able to find those. Well, before we get to that, let me ask another question, and I'll find some of those other questions. Is Heather asks, how do you choose a zoo to partner with? For instance, isn't Fresno Zoo a little bit closer, and would that keep the stress of the travel down for the frogs? Or so what is that process like?
Yeah, that's a great question. We actually at first started working with the Fresno Zoo a long time ago, and they had a malfunction in their facility. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it's a kind of sensitive process that involves water quality for tadpoles, and then the right food for the frogs and the tadpoles so that they can grow, keeping them from getting infected from any kind of infection that they might get in a hospital, if you will, not just the disease that's affecting frogs, the amphibian chytrid fungus. And so they had a major malfunction that basically we lost the entire cohort of animals that were collected. And so they decided that they didn't want to do that work anymore until they could figure it out and be confident that that wouldn't happen again. And they're still not there yet, but they have come back to the table. They've never really left the table. They just needed to kind of figure things out before they could in earnest try to get back into doing that work like the other zoos are. And I think they're getting really close to being able to be one of the zoos that we can work with. And luckily, even though it's a longer drive to the Bay Area, we haven't had any losses from the drives. It is more resources to get there, more time, more gas, but we haven't had any impacts from that longer drive. So that's been a good thing. But when Fresno comes back online, if they come back online, we'll have another zoo that we can work with, which means more animals that can be processed, and it will be quicker time-wise. And so we hope that they can get there soon. So Oakland and San Francisco stepped up. We've been working with them. So have other parks like Yosemite and National Forests in the Sierra Nevada. And then in Southern California, they've been working with the San Diego Zoo and the LA Zoo. Then UC Santa Barbara Zoo has talked about trying to come online like Fresno is. And so it's kind of a big group effort. There's varying stages of efficacy at this point, and we're just working with whoever's able to work with us.
All right. And we've got another question from Bill. He says, any idea why the chytrid fungus is now such a threat relatively to historic levels? Is there?
Yeah, that's a great question too. And thankfully we have a good answer for it. It's not unknown. The best we know based on science is that the amphibian chytrid fungi, there's a lot of chytrid fungi in the world. There's hundreds of species. They mostly live in soil. At some point in the last 100, 200, 300 years, one species, this Batrachochytrium dendrobatitis is its Latin name, evolved to be able to go into water, and it evolved to infect amphibians, and it started moving around the world. And so we have specimens in museums and other areas that go back about 100 years. And so in South America and Asia, there are instances of chytrid fungus and amphibians going back 100 or more years. And then in Africa, there's instances that go back almost 100 years. And then in Western North America and Western United States, it's only been in the last 40 years or so. From what we understand, it arrived in California in the 1960s, south of the Bay Area. It made up to the Sierra Nevada in the 1970s, and it slowly went from frog population to frog population over the last almost 50 years. But we still have a few populations that are not infected. Believe it or not, after 50 years, it hasn't gotten to every population, but we only have like 10 of them, 10 or 20, I would say, across the range. All of the other hundreds of populations have gotten infected and they have crashed. It's a very severe impact, a very severe disease. The frogs are highly susceptible to it. And when the disease gets established in a population, it just makes them crash. And so that's why.
And Danny, kind of along that same vein, we have a question from James. He asks, are visitors to the park inadvertently bringing in and introducing foreign non-Indigenous species that are competing and or affecting Indigenous species populations?
Yeah, that's another great question, and we try to do education around that. Luckily, that is a very small piece of the puzzle, a very small part of the problem, if you will, in things that impact endangered species, at least with these two frog species. The data that we have for how chytrid fungus moves around, it suggests that humans, if they're moving it around at all, are not really having a big impact on how it's moving around naturally, or besides humans moving it around. And that comes from, there have been some very popular areas where humans have walked by, like thousands of people have walked by. They've put their water filters in the water to get water. They've went fishing there. They went swimming there. Their boots are getting wet, and those populations did not get infected for long periods of time. And so that suggests that humans are not, if they are moving it around, it's not a big part of the problem. But other things could be, like if we allow fishing in the backcountry, but we don't allow live bait, like in the form of goldfish, if you will. So if people decided to disregard that and they brought live bait into the backcountry, like a fish like goldfish, and before they left, they dropped the fish in the water that they didn't use, then that could establish a new population, which would have a big negative effect. So we hope that people understand that that's against the law, it's against policy, that they understand that that would be a bad thing to do. And luckily, we don't have many instances of that having happened, but it has happened a little bit, and it could happen, here and there. And we just hope that that's a minimum. It has been a minimal thing, and we hope it stays that way.
And we're going to kind of shift away a little bit from frogs. We might have a couple more questions for frogs, but this question came in from Calvin, who's 13 years old. And he wanted to know how each of you chose your area of expertise. So Tyler, we'll start with you. So Calvin wants to know again, how did you choose your area of expertise?
It was probably a combination of passion and luck. I definitely was always driven towards an interest in large mammals and driven towards that work. And then willing and able to move just about anywhere to join a project, get on a study or something like that, and learn what I could and build up a lot of experience. So it was really a combination of those things.
Awesome. And Danny, same question to you. How did you choose your area of expertise?
Yeah, similar. It started out when I was young. I loved going fishing as a kid, and that got me into nature, but I really loved fishing and therefore developed a fondness for fish. And I learned that I could go to college and major in a fisheries degree. And so I went to undergraduate and got my fisheries degree. And then I did a seasonal job in fisheries, which confirmed kind of my love for it. And I decided to go to graduate school and get a graduate degree in fisheries. And then I kept, devoting my career to the kind of the freshwater aquatic ecology discipline. And what's interesting is where I ended up in a job where fish are non-native, and so they've had a negative impact. And so we're removing fish from certain areas. But what's nice for balance is that it's a huge park. Down in the lower elevations, fish are native. And so we're trying to conserve them and protect them and restore them. People can fish for them there. And even in the backcountry where they're non-native, people can still fish for them. So they can still have this amazing, fun, family, traditional experience. But there's so many places where the fish exist. We can, restore some of them, still provide a lot of areas for fishing, but still, work on the issue of how they impact the native ecosystem and try to restore through that habitat restoration process. So that's how I got into it.
Awesome. Thank you guys. And along that same vein, Nicole Perez, she asks to both of you, she's curious, which species are you most passionate about and why? So Tyler, we can start with you.
I've spent a good chunk of my adult life researching different bear species, and that has really, I guess, been my bread and butter in graduate school. I spent years studying bear-human interaction in Yellowstone, and I guess I probably know more about that critter, that group of species than anything else in this world. So. And in here, it's not a species of concern in particular for in terms of their population numbers, but it certainly is a very common species in the park and something that we manage more than research.
And Danny, to you, same question.
Well, I'm going to cheat a little bit and say like groups of animals. We use the word herpetofauna to mean amphibian and reptile species. So I love herpetofauna, which are kind of all amphibians and reptiles, whether they're aquatic or terrestrial. And I already told you how I love fish. And so if I had to narrow it down, I have a soft spot for frogs. And so it's pretty cool that I get to work with endangered. It stinks that they're endangered. They're having a tough time, but it's great that I have the good fortune of being able to work with some critters I really love and care a lot about, and to try to make a difference.
And I just learned a brand new word, Danny. I have never heard that word before. I can't even repeat it. Never heard that word, which might be my favorite thing about this conversation.
Yeah, herpetology is the study of amphibians and reptiles. So fauna is animal. So herpetofauna is like amphibian and reptiles.
Herpetofauna. I challenge everybody to say that 5 times fast. And our next question comes to us from Lanny, and he asks, this is a question for both of you. Do you feel like some of the T&E populations that we've talked about tonight are beginning, do you guys feel like they're beginning to trend upward?
Yeah, oh, hi Lanny, how you doing? He was working for us during the fire. That is a very hard question. Unfortunately, one of the most difficult things about endangered species, and particularly endangered mammals, is they're very hard to count. We do have, all the people working on Bighorn Sheep have spent a tremendous amount of resources trying to count those animals. But as I mentioned before, we only have rough estimates of Fisher, Sierra Nevada red fox, and some of our other endangered mammals across, kind of the Sierra. So I think it's difficult and maybe too soon to say whether across the board things are increasing or decreasing.
Danny, do you have anything to weigh in on that?
Yeah. So again, it's a nuanced answer. There are, if I just focused on the frog project, because that's where most of the time of my position it goes to. It takes about 2/3 to 3/4 of my time to manage that one big project. We have several instances across the park where the populations are growing due to a combination of natural adaptation and human Park Service assisted habitat restoration and recovery actions. So that gives us a signal and some hope that if it's started to happen in some areas, that over time it should happen in more areas. And we just have to kind of play the process out. Unfortunately, it's like a 30 to 40 year process of these frogs being able to adapt to the disease enough where they could control it, stabilize, and then the population grow and then get really thriving and abundant again. That's like a 30 to 40 year process. And so we have a few population that have gone through that evolution and have started to grow, and they are super key populations now. And even more so in Yosemite, they have even more populations that have started to grow. They're like further ahead on this trajectory. So since we're both big parks in the Sierra Nevada, and we're both Park Service sites that do a lot of kind of protection and conservation and restoration, it gives us very good hope that we're going to follow in their trajectory. We're just 10 or 20 years behind them, and if we have this conversation again in 10 and 20 years, we're going to see a better situation.
And there's we've had a couple of questions around this topic, and I'll kind of wrap up all those questions in Lee's question. And he asks, will climate change partially negate all of the efforts to restore endangered species? And will some of these species die off due to warming temperatures? And we've got a couple of questions along that same vein of climate change. So from both of your perspectives, can you tell us a little bit about how climate change might affect some of the efforts that we're doing right now to help restore some of these species?
Well,
Tyler, you first.
this is going to be similar to the last response, and it's very difficult to predict. There might be some species that benefit. There might be some species that do worse. There might be some species that are not affected, and we're still trying to understand how that's going to happen. And with some species, like fisher, for example, the forest is changing so quickly with tree mortality from extensive drought and now massive wildfires. We are trying to continually catch up with just researching the animals to understand what's happening right now, let alone what might happen in 5, 10, 15, or 20 years. I can say that in the Sierra, especially in Sequoia and Kings Canyon, we might be okay in certain ways because we have such high elevation habitat. So for some of these high alpine species like Bighorn Sheep or Sierra Nevada red fox, they might theoretically have more high elevation habitat than they might be in other places of the mountain range where the habitats only get to 10 or 11,000 feet. But again, it's too early to tell.
Yeah.
So we'll keep an eye on it though.
Yeah, that's a good answer, Tyler. And similar in the aquatic world, there's definitely, the species are definitely vulnerable to climate change. One of the reasons we're doing this high lake restoration project targeting on these endangered frogs is a lot of the populations are restricted to really small, shallow pond habitat in a lake basin because the larger, deeper, colder lake habitat has non-native fish in it. So we're doing some of the restoration in areas like that so that those frog populations and the rest of the ecosystem can occupy those larger, colder, deeper habitats that are going to be more resistant to drought, more resistant to water temperature warming, and will still have watery habitat for these species to exist in instead of drying up or getting too warm. And so like Tyler said, we have a lot of areas like that in our big park landscape and our extensive high elevations that buffers climate change to some extent. But there are certainly other areas like the little current golden trout. We just have one population and it's in a middle elevation, small stream habitat. It's extremely vulnerable to drying and warming. And I fear that 30 years from now, that population could not be able, it might not be able to occupy that habitat anymore. And we'll have to do a salvage where we move those fish to another spot that still has water. And so, you know, depends on the area, depends on the species, but there's definitely impacts that there's impacts that likely will occur from climate change to some of our endangered species conservation efforts.
Thank you both so much. I know that climate change plays a huge role that we're still trying to learn exactly what that role is. And so thank you to everybody that asked questions about climate change and bringing that idea to this conversation. It's a huge part of this conversation. So thank you all for that. And we've got two more questions that we're going to ask, and one is for Tyler and one is for Danny, specific to their areas of study. And so Tyler, the first question for you comes from Jane Thomas, and she says that she's seen the Cascade red foxes at Rainier, and she's curious about how closely they are related to the foxes in the Sierra Nevada.
Quite close. They are one of a handful of subpopulations of montane red fox that occur along the west coast from the southern Sierra all the way through into British Columbia. And they're more related than other montane red foxes that might occur in both the Great Basin and in the Rocky Mountains. What can be difficult is that we lack a large number of genetic samples in the Sierra Nevada population. We might be looking at 9 or 10 individuals that we have genetic samples from. So we're comparing a population in the Cascades, for example, where we'd have a large number of genetic samples to probably not a really good representation of what we have in the Sierra Nevada. So they are probably cousins, would be the best way to describe it.
Thank you, Tyler. I like that. I feel like I say that word a lot when I'm talking with people in the parks, like that, using that cousin, kind of very tangible explanation. Danny, a question to you from Bill, which I love this question. Bill, thanks for asking it. He asks, can an amateur tell the difference between the two species of yellow-legged frog?
Oh, that's a great question. First, I have to go back to the cousin comment. I'm all Italian and we use cousin a lot. Everybody's cousin.
Everyone's cousin.
I would say no. Even experts can't really tell by looking at them. We know just from genetic samples and from the data that we have that kind of, that has delineated these populations, we know if where we are on the landscape is one species or the other, but we can't tell by looking at them. Each population is a little different based on local characteristics. So the same species could look wildly different in two lake basins that are right next to each other. And so, each site is unique, and yeah, you can't really tell by looking at them which species it is.
And you know what? We actually have a couple more minutes I've got two other really good questions that I just saw. One is really quick. It comes from Michelle, and she asks, is there a website where, or they ask, is there a website where currently endangered species populations, if there's a list of those, if there's a website people can go to see what the list of endangered species are? Anybody know?
Tyler, you want to take that?
That changes constantly. So, I know that sounds like it should be an easy thing, but animals are coming in and out of listing status, different status. Almost, not I would say every day, but like every month at least. So there are some websites. If I can look up a couple. I have all these things bookmarked on my computer. It's crashed. It's in the lab. So I think a quick Google search, a couple minutes, I might be able to find something and put it in the chat. But the Fish and Wildlife Service websites generally have species that are broken down by area. So you can maybe look for the number of endangered species or the types of endangered species in, say, like California or something like that. But across the country, it gets more complicated. And then also, without getting off on a tangent, the Fish and Wildlife Service sometimes recognizes endangered species in other countries as a way to kind of control and lend assistance to like illegal trafficking of, say, like tiger parks or something like that. So sometimes you look for endangered species, you might get animals in other countries that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service just recognizes as endangered, but don't actually live here. So it can get really complicated.
Yeah, I'd say your best bet is to go to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service website, and then they have endangered species pages that can give you a lot of information. That's actually where I went to today to get like the 16 or 1800 species. list each species. I just got the numbers of how many there are under the responsibility of the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service, which is under NOAA, if you've heard of National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, that does weather and everything like that. NIMS and NMFS, National Marine Fisheries Service, is under NOAA. So if you go to NOAA website, you can look up the marine species. And if you go to US Fish and Wildlife Service, you can look up the terrestrial and freshwater species.
And I did post a website that will take some searching. It's not user-friendly. It's for dorks like Danny and me that have to do compliance. It's not real. It's not great for public use, but if you play around on that, you should be able to get an idea of endangered species across the country.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. And our last question, and if you guys can both just take a minute or so to answer this, I think it's a great question to wrap us up, comes from Heather, and she asks, how do we determine what species to study to determine what the numbers are in the park? So Danny, you've been working with yellow mountain, or the mountain yellow-legged frog, and Tyler, you are working, we've done stuff with the bighorn sheep and the red fox and pika and fishers. And what is the mechanism to determine that those are the species that we chose to study and to learn more about and to have those recovery plans for? You guys can both just take, I know it's a loaded question, but if you can both just take a minute to answer that, that would be great.
Who do you want to go first?
Tyler, let's have you go first, and then Danny will wrap you up.
Thank you. It could be a little it could be a little complicated because we have more endangered species and more vulnerable species and at-risk species than we have people that can focus on them. So there's probably, depending on the park and depending on the job, it sometimes is a matter of which species are doing the worst, where can we make the most impact, and then sometimes which of the species are most, how can I put this, most influenced by our own actions. Like that we've talked about the fisher a little bit, they live in places that people live. And so when we have prescribed fires and we build like visitor centers and stuff, we directly impact that species. And so we have to consider that a little bit more, and some of our efforts are targeted more to understanding those species as opposed to something like Sierra Nevada red fox, which are also very important, but incredibly difficult to study and take a lot of effort with, and we don't have a lot of potential to impact. They don't have a lot of potential to impact our like day-to-day park operations.
Danny, anything to add?
That's great info, Tyler. I'll just riff off of that and say that we have management plans. I told you about the conservation strategy for frogs. We also have a restoration plan that we've designed and we're working off of for doing our restoration actions in the high lakes. But we also have what's called a resource stewardship strategy, which has tried to holistically look at all of the natural resources that are in the parks and they're under the purview of the Division of Resources Management and Science that Tyler and I are a part of. And we have kind of tried to look at everything under our purview and determine what are the things we should focus on. And like Tyler said, it's like, what things do we actually have skill to deal with? What things are amenable to our actions that will actually matter and make a difference? So those kind of things tie together, and then we prioritize. We only have, like Tyler said, we only have so many people, we only have so much money, we only have so much time. We have to prioritize what to work on because there's not enough capacity to work on everything. And so those are some of the reasons how we narrow it down.
Thank you both so much for your time and for just widening our view on so many different things when we think about Sequoia and Kings Canyon, we think about endangered species, we think about recovery, and we think about how we even choose to tackle all of these different species. And thank you so much for both of you for taking your time to share your expertise, your passion, and for helping all of our all of our attendees have that conversation with you. I think the greatest thing, what Savannah mentioned in her intro video, when we talk about these really giant conversations, it really is a conversation. And I think that Savannah says it the best, that national parks are where that kind of great conversation happens. And so I want to say thank you both so much for joining tonight. Thank you all who participated in our Q&As, who participated in the chat. It's incredible to see all of your participation and your enthusiasm for these places that we all love so much. And we do want to encourage everybody to stay a part of the conversation. We want to keep these conversations going. It's not just this one night where for an hour and a half where we're talking. We invite you all to stay a part of the conversation and to contribute to the conversation. And some ways that you can do that are to follow us on social media. You can follow Sequoia Parks Conservancy on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter. We're going to be putting some of those links into the chat. And we invite you to follow the story, keep engaging in the story. We post about the mountain yellow-legged frogs and the other species in the parks on our social media pages, and it's a great way to stay in tune with what's happening in the parks. You can also sign up for our newsletter where we go a little bit more in depth to what's happening in the park, and it's called The Compass, and we would love for you all to receive that so you can continue to submit your questions, submit your ideas, and really keep joining in that conversation. And you can also become our friend. Become a friend of SPC. We are trying to get as many friends as possible. And Danny and Tyler both mentioned that nonprofits play a huge role in when we talk about recovery plans. And we want to invite you to help to be a part of that recovery plan. We do a lot of work to support Tyler and Danny. So if you want to become our friend and help with that process, we would love to have you as our friends. And we also have some really fun products in our visitor centers. We actually have a stuffed mountain yellow-legged frog in our visitor center. It's really cute. And $5 of every one of those frogs goes to Danny's program to help restore some of those populations. And so those are a couple of quick ways that you can stay a part of the conversation. We've got another giant conversation next month where we're going to be talking about fire in the park. So we would love for you all to join that conversation as well. And again, as we wrap up, I just want to say thank you to everybody who joined, and Tyler and Danny, thank you both so much for taking the time to bring us into your world a little bit and expand our view of the endangered species here in Sequoia and Kings. So thank you guys.